Well, hello and welcome to today's discussion on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the so-called Iran deal. It's a very timely discussion. A few days ago, the Biden administration announced that it has re-entered indirect talks with Iran on ways that the US could re-enter the JCPOA, the Iran deal. In a moment, I'm going to introduce today's very distinguished and very knowledgeable panel here to enlighten us on what is at stake in these discussions between the Biden administration and Iran. First, an especially warm welcome to the members of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Your support has helped us through this difficult time to maintain these types of discussions, as well as to support the polling and analysis to which we will be referring during this discussion. So thank you for your support. As a reminder, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs is a nonpartisan, independent organization that does not maintain institutional positions on any issues. The opinions discussed today, including by myself, are the opinions of the speakers and not necessarily those of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. We will be providing an opportunity for all of you who are tuning in to ask questions of this panel for the last 20 minutes or so of today's event. And you can ask those questions by typing in ccga.live into your browser. If you go to ccga.live and follow the prompts, you'll be able both to ask questions and also to upvote questions that you see that others have already placed there. Finally, today's session is, of course, on the record. It will be held for posterity in YouTube. And we do have several members of the Fourth Estate who are tuned in watching today, and you are very welcome. So with all of the housekeeping out of the way, allow me to introduce our panelists. First, we have Ambassador Jim Jeffries. Jim is the former US ambassador to Iraq, to Turkey, and to Albania, 3 countries with a deep-seated interest in what happens in Iran. Most recently, he coordinated the US government's effort to find an international response to the humanitarian and security nightmare that is in Syria these days. So Jim, you are very welcome today. Nice to see you again. Secondly, if you've turned on a TV at any point in the last 3 or 4 years, you will recognize John Brennan, the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency. I believe it was 2013 to 2017. John spent a great deal of his career working on South Asian and Middle Eastern issues, and of course, non-proliferation would have been a big part of those issues. So John, you're very welcome here. Thank you for being here today. And finally, tuning in from the United Kingdom, Roxane Farmanfarmaian. She is a lecturer in international politics at Cambridge University, one of my favorite places on the planet. She's an expert on the Middle East, and you will see her name often in articles on the Middle East, most recently on the kind of mysterious and troubling events in Jordan, because we apparently don't have enough problems in the world. We're now looking at what's happening in Jordan. But Roxane, thank you for tuning in today, and you are very welcome here. I thought the best thing to do, we do have a knowledgeable audience today, but it would be good to lay the groundwork of where we are and what the Biden administration has inherited. So I'm going to ask 3 discrete questions to our panelists. First, we're going to ask Ambassador Jeffrey to tell us what the JCPOA was and was not, because what it was not seemed to cause some of the confusion leading into the early years of the Trump administration and some of the criticisms of the agreement, frankly. And then we're going to turn to John, to Director Brennan, to discuss what has happened in Iran and in the region since the US pulled out of the JCPOA. And then we're going to turn to Dr. Farmanfarmaian to tell us a little bit about what the attitude on the street in Iran and throughout the Middle East is toward the JCPOA, toward the United States and our decision to pull out. And what are the politics of this agreement in Iran? Because Iran does have politics, and sometimes it's good to remember that it's a complicated situation in the country. So we'll start with Jim. Can you tell us a little bit about the JCPOA? You have to unmute yourself, Jim.
Happy to, and again, thanks for being here. The JCPOA was an agreement negotiated at the end of 2015 and entering into force at the beginning of 2016. Between the US, France, Britain, Russia, China, the 5 Security Council permanent members, along with the EU and Germany and Iran, which, along with a corresponding Security Council resolution, put into place a set of commitments on the two sides, Iran on one, everybody else on the other. First of all, the lifting of all UN, or waiving of all UN, US, and EU nuclear-related, that's very important, nuclear-related sanctions in return for Iran taking a number of steps. First of all, a very aggressive International Atomic Energy Agency inspection regime, which is in most respects permanent. Secondly, a sliding time scale of limitations on its enrichment in plutonium heavy water programs. At the time it entered into effect, most estimates were, John would know better than I, Iran was within a month or two, or maybe even a few weeks from having enough fissile material for one nuclear device. And the idea was to push that back to a year, which the JCPOA, most people believe, achieved. But again, it's a sliding scale beginning after 5 years, which is essentially now, after 10 years, which many of the agreements, particularly on enrichment, go away, and after 15 years, almost all are lifted, other than, again, the inspections. The JCPOA did not deal with all of the other problems with Iran, and that's the key point I want people to focus on. The Iranian nuclear program is a double problem. Any challenge to the international orders, non-proliferation regime is a Class A immediate problem, regardless of who, thus India, Pakistan, South Africa, Libya, and it is very important to focus on it because of the non-proliferation aspects. But in some cases, to some degree now or previously with Iraq and North Korea, and certainly with Iran today, it is also a symbol or a sign of a larger problem of the country that's pursuing it. In Iran's case, it is a challenge to the regional security order, an effort to try to achieve hegemony through the use of terrorism, conventional missiles and rockets, undermining of governments from Baghdad to Beirut, and even Syria, certainly Yemen. And that is a separate problem. Again, the JCPOA did not pretend to tackle that. But many people were concerned about two things. First of all, that going into the JCPOA, various actors in the EU and the United States would give up on the rest of the Iranian agenda. That is, that's the price we pay. That's very controversial. I have my own views. Others have their views. I think to some degree that was correct, at least in practice, that we wouldn't deal with the other problems, but just be happy with the JCPOA resolution. Secondly, there's the time element. That led Trump in 2018 to cancel the agreement, reinstate the sanctions, and Iran in return to react by increasing enrichment. Now they're somewhere between 3 and 6 months to a sufficient quantity of fissile material, which is, of course, a danger. The Biden administration wants to go back. Presumably the Iranians want to too. That would be a good thing. The last thing the Biden administration needs, and John and I were both in White Houses that had to deal with an Iran a few weeks away from a nuclear capability, day in, day out, it drags you away from everything else. Biden clearly is correct in wanting to end that. But the problem is, what do you do with Iran in the region? How do the two fit together? How does the JCPOA fit into a larger Iran policy? We haven't seen that yet from the Biden administration. Thank you.
Thanks, John. That's an excellent introduction. Thank you very, very much. John, let's talk about what has happened in Iran and in the Middle East. There was no NBS that the public was talking about, certainly 6 or 7 years ago, that should impact or could impact our negotiations.
Right. Well, thank you, Cécile, for the invitation to join my distinguished colleagues. Great to see Jim again and Roxane. And Jim provided an excellent laydown about the foundations of the JCPOA, which the Obama administration really saw as a building block upon which other types of negotiations could come from, spring from, and hopefully even strengthening the JCPOA over time. But I think Obama recognized that there was only a limited amount of time in his administration to get some things done. So what has happened since Donald Trump assumed office and now we are in the Biden administration? Well, first of all, those advocates within the Iranian political environment who advocated for the JCPOA, the so-called moderates, President Rouhani, Foreign Minister Zarif, and others, I think they were really undercut by the actions of the Trump administration. As soon as Trump came into office, he was already he sent signals that he was very much opposed to the JCPOA, believing it was the worst deal ever negotiated. And so I think Rouhani, Zarif, and others really were then fighting a battle against the hardliners who basically were saying, "We told you so." And despite a lot of concern that Iran was going to violate the agreement first, it was in fact the United States who decided to pull out in May of 2019. And so when that happened, the Iranians decided to then say that they were no longer going to be bound by the JCPOA. And so they said they were not going to be limited by the restrictions on heavy water, on uranium stockpiles. And then in subsequent months, they decided to ratchet up the level of uranium enrichment as a way to send a signal that if the United States was not going to abide by the agreement and if the sanctions then were being not only reinstituted but also strengthened, that the Iranians were not going to sit idly by on that. So I think you see in the political front that the hardliners were strengthened. Now, one of the premier hardliners, Qasem Soleimani, was killed as a result of the Trump administration action against him in Iraq. But again, I think that ferment within the Iranian political system is still unsettled, particularly in the run-up to the presidential election that we held in June. The issue of the question of trust between the two sides, I think, is something that continues to come to the forefront, both in Washington and in Tehran. But again, I think that there is deep suspicion in the Iranian body politic, and even in Iran itself, that the United States, even if it decides to rejoin, will stay engaged in that discussion. More broadly, again, the Iranian nuclear program, I'm not saying the nuclear weapons program, but the nuclear program continues to move forward. In December of last year, the Guardians Council passed a law basically mandating that there needed to be additional enrichment activity if, in fact, sanctions are not going to be lifted. And so that high upward enrichment activity that would go into the areas of real concern in terms of shortening the timeline to a breakout scenario, as Jim mentioned, that has not yet taken place. But in fact, they have moved forward with some of that lower enriched uranium activity that is very worrisome, again, in terms of reducing the amount of time that there would be enough fissile material for a warhead that could, in fact, be delivered on a weapon system. In the region itself, the Iranians continue to carry out a number of their troublemaking activities inside of Iraq. You see in Yemen that the Houthis, which are aligned with Iran, continues to carry out its activities inside of Yemen, causing tremendous devastation and bloodshed. So the Saudis that are involved in Yemen on the military front continue to see Iran as a real regional menace, as do other players in the region. Certainly the Israelis are concerned about Iranian terrorist-related activities, its continued missile development, and now also on the nuclear front. So I think there is increasing concern that as a result of the lapse in the JCPOA obligations, that things are moving in a untoward direction for regional stability and security. And I think there is anticipation throughout the region that these talks that are underway, indirect as they may be, hopefully will lead to some type of opportunity to synchronize, in my word, synchronize the return to compliance on the part of the United States as well as Iran, so that there can be, again, a basis to be able to prevent any march that some within Iran would like to engage in toward a nuclear weapon, but also to see whether or not there's an opportunity to engage in broader discussions with the Iranians. And one of the things I think we have to remember is that a lot of times folks here in the political environment, and certainly in Washington, D.C., and members of Congress will look at Iran through a very American prism and look at all the things that Iran has done. Well, you have a corollary prism that the Iranian leaders look at the United States over the course of the last, many, many decades. And so there is right now, I think, a standoff, but I'm hoping that these talks that are underway will in fact allow a return to, again, what I saw as a foundation stone to build for other types of negotiations that could in fact lead to some positive developments for the region as a whole, as well as maybe an eventual return of Iran to the community of nations.
Excellent. Thank you for that update on the current situation. That was really outstanding. Roxane, what's the mood on the street, and what's your take on the view of the politicians who, as John just said, lost an awful lot of face when the U.S. pulled out of the agreement, which the mullahs had, I understand, warned them was going to happen all along. So what's your take of the mood on the street and in the body politic there?
Well, first of all, fantastic groundwork laid by both my colleagues here. And indeed, when Biden was elected, there was an upsurge among the population in the hopes that sanctions would be lifted and that the opportunities could really be restarted. And it's interesting, in Iran, the deal was sold very differently than it was in the US. It was an opportunity. It was something that was considered a diplomatic success, and it was celebrated. And when it passed, people poured into the streets. And here, I think it was very much more viewed as a bad deal to contain a bad country. And so it didn't have the same resonance whatsoever. And I think that's very much what we're reaping today. And so when Biden got elected, I think there was really a hope that things would change and shift, and the polls showed the Iranian people really raising their hopes and supporting a return to the deal that had really foundered over the previous 2 years. What we're seeing, however, is that this delay is providing an opportunity to sour the situation, and if anything, trust, which could possibly have been reconstituted, has had, if anything, a greater fraying as a result. And I think there's a sense among the government and among the people that every day that delays is one more day of maximum pressure. And this has sent 4 million people under the poverty line. It's reduced the middle class, which is the very group that is the most secular and the most outspoken. So that certainly has shown that the sanctions have not achieved what they set out to accomplish. And on top of that, it certainly has not changed the posture of the government. So if I could turn to that as my next point and say that indeed, the reformists led by the current President Rouhani and his rather celebrity foreign minister Javad Zarif is on the back foot. They had, I think, hoped very much to be in a very different place by now, that if Biden had gone back right away along with the WHO and the Paris Climate Agreement, that actually the program would be winding down in Iran and negotiators would already be on to considering adjustments and next steps. And instead, grinding sanctions. And I think they feel there's a real double standard because the American government has come out saying it's really going to focus on human rights. And yet the humanitarian relief that Iran has hoped to get has consistently been denied. And if Vienna falters, that means this will continue because the Trump administration put on not only the heaviest sanctions on Iran since the hostage crisis, but added on a whole new set of secondary sanctions, including denying Iran the right to its own foreign reserves. So it hasn't been able to pay for humanitarian help. And in the midst of COVID, this has been taken very much to heart by the people, and it's been hit particularly hard as a country in the region. Politically, indeed, it's about to have an election, and under these circumstances, it's the conservatives that are most likely to win. They've already shown they can win because they swept the parliamentary elections in the fall and now command about 80 to 85% of the parliament. It was they that passed this, constraining law obliging the government to put a constraint on the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy inspectors, doing unscheduled inspections and monitoring, which is one of the big issues that we're going to lose if we lose the JCPOA. It's that aspect of surprise that is what really stops Iran then from secretly creating a weapon. On the other hand, politically, I think they feel as though the situation has shifted very much, because one of the stories that we often don't realize actually go together in terms of when the JCPOA was passed is that there was a huge transfer of arms to the Gulf states across the water. And that has changed the security situation for Iran substantially. And so the nuclear tool, the nuclear program, in many ways was for them, for many years, a sort of bargaining chip that they could give away that would enable them to bargain themselves back into the international and regional community. Now, with the degree of arms buildup and capacity in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they are now talking about it becoming a deterrent that is actually an instrument, a weapon. And a fatwa that the US has never taken very seriously, but that always was said by the supreme leader, we are going to not create weapons, now is being talked about in the public commons as something that should be reconsidered, and that a weapon is something that they should maybe imagine. And without the JCPOA and the inspectors there, the primary purpose of that deal, which is a proliferation deal, when it really comes down to it, the most important thing in all of our lives, I think, is we don't want another nuclear weapon around, certainly not down in the Gulf. And this deal actually was a good deal for that purpose. And without it, I think we're very vulnerable. And I think the Iranians know it. They just signed a deal with China for 25 years of support economically and militarily, and that's given them some space to push back. And so that's, I think, where we are at the moment.
Well, you bring up two really, really important issues there. One is China, and I would add Russia to the mix, and some of its relations with Iran. And secondly, the proliferation angle. You know, India developed a nuclear program, and then Pakistan developed a nuclear program. And Pakistan developed a nuclear weapon, and Iran which has a long border, 1,000 kilometers, as I recall, with Pakistan. Iran began its nuclear program. So what's at stake in the Middle East if 6 months from now or a year from now, Iran can announce that it has a nuclear weapon? What do the Gulf states and the rest of the Middle East, do any of them feel like they have to have one just for political reasons, for person on the street, national pride reasons? Any thoughts on that? John, this was one of the issues I'm sure that you worked very closely on. Any thoughts on the proliferation aspect of what happens if Iran actually gets very close or does develop a weapon?
Well, absolutely. And the Emiratis and the Saudis for many years were very concerned that they would need to go down that nuclear weapons path, either development or by acquisition from foreign countries such as a Pakistan or a China, because they felt as though they needed to keep pace with Iran. And if Iran was going to have a nuclear weapon, that would lead them to take certain steps. And it's not just on the nuclear weapons proliferation front, it's on the missile proliferation front, as has been mentioned. The Iranians continue to develop those missiles. Now, during the Obama administration, there was a real push to try to include missile talks in the JCPOA discussions, the secret discussions. But President Obama pointed out that, if we go for missile reduction talks, the Iranians are going to point to the Gulf side of the Gulf in terms of Gulf Arab states and missiles that are there, U.S. missiles and others. And that would just raise a whole host of other issues. So I do think that getting the JCPOA back in place, at least putting a stake in the ground to prevent this nuclear weapons development, is a very important, a critically important first step to see whether or not that can give life to some other types of discussions that will reduce the level of tension as well as the level of military buildup, which includes on the proliferation front on very dangerous nuclear and missile development activities.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Jim, I spent 25 years in the Foreign Service, and the entire time my goal was to be the first DCM back in Tehran, or maybe the first Consul General back in Shiraz or Qum or somewhere. and it never happened, obviously. So my question is, now we've got so the Russians building ports. Apparently, we have, particularly in Syria, we have, as Roxane just said, we have China signing huge deals with Iran. How important is it? And is there a way for us to finally move forward on the nation-to-nation relationship and maybe to have a little more contact in some other areas, or are we just going to cede all of these relationships to China and to Russia?
I'm skeptical, and I was afraid that there would be too much agreement in this panel because I, like the others, have no particular problem in the right conditions of Biden going back into the JCPOA. But I have to focus on the regional situation. Yes, there are things worse in this world than another country getting a nuclear weapon, although, as I said earlier, that becomes a Class A emergency situation for all the reasons we've heard. And that is the undercutting of a regional or global security order. And that's what's at stake. That's what I saw every day for the last 2.5 years when I was traveling around the region. That's why 58 senators voted essentially against the agreement in 2015. It's why the Abraham Accords were set up with a half a dozen states essentially creating an anti-Iran bloc, and other states such as Egypt and Turkey, while not part of it, making it clear that they're very unhappy about Iran in the region. The truth is, Iran has a whole separate regional foreign policy. From the time it signed the first agreement with us, which was 2013, we forget that, the JPOA, which certainly indicated the international community wanted to deal with Iran, until 2018, when Trump pulled out. Look at Iran's position and march through 4 countries: Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Far more powerful, far more influential by 2018 than in 2013. That sent up alarm bells all over the region. It was a major reason why Trump pulled out of it and why others recommended that he do so, to combat or contest Iran in these areas. Iran does not want to sit down with us, particularly without any leverage on our part after we go back to the JCPOA and end our sanctions, to talk about what it's doing in those countries, what it's doing with its missile program. It basically figures that file is closed with the possible exception of Yemen. And the reason that Biden has taken the seemingly difficult position of you go first, I'm not going to go until you go, is he knows this pressure in the Senate, among our allies in the region and such. He doesn't want to show that he wants the agreement more than the Iranians. He fears that they are going to ask for other things, like lifting Trump's non-JCPOA sanctions that were imposed for terrorism, for missiles, and for other things. And that's the deal that we have before us now. Whether we can find something that is only limited to the JCPOA as the administration tries to work out how it will contest Iran in the region, because that's what all of our partners want and expect us to do.
So yeah, I want to come back to particularly the lack of inclusion of missiles and some other aspects in the agreement. But Roxane, interestingly, the return to the JCPOA agreement is more popular in the US than apparently it is in Iran. My colleagues at the Chicago Council have just published some really fascinating analysis of polling. In the US, support for returning to the JCPOA seems to be at about 54%, much more popular among Democrats than among Republicans. In Iran, it's just about 51%, although it's been rising recently. And you mentioned that it had gotten very unpopular, but there seems to be some support building again. What happens if we don't get an agreement, basically? What happens if Iran refuses to return to all of its conditions, or if the US refuses to return to all of its conditions? Because we're each demanding that the other side return to all of its original JCPOA conditions. So what happens if there is no deal? What happens inside of Iran politically or to the population? And what happens in the region? Because I think Jim is making a really good point of Iran really engaged in abhorrent behavior in Iraq and Syria and Yemen and other places, and even in Afghanistan. So what's your take on this, Roxane? You have to unmute, Roxane.
First of all, to look at what happens inside Iran and where it goes if there's no deal. clearly the first step was already taken in signing this, this long-term arrangement with China, and a similar one was signed a few months ago with Russia. It was an extension of an existing one, not quite as groundbreaking, but nonetheless solidifying the relationship between Iran and the two other powers. And although I think Iranians would much prefer remaining close to the West, they have consistently found that they don't work well with the expectations and the politics. I'm looking at it from their perspective in terms of where they sit and the power they wield and the aspirations they have. And I think looking at Iran over the last 40 years, one of the things, there's two things that and I agree, maybe we won't have a lot of agreement, but I'd like to look at it from their perspective for a moment, as you've asked. And that is, I think that Iranians are much more in favor of their government than we often realize. The same kinds of polls, Iran poll, which the council worked with, consistently shows that the Iranians are quite pleased with the performance of their government. However, what they did 40 years ago was that they chose an option to throw out the Shah and take on a elected or some form of elected government, which was basically a step towards being citizens rather than subjects. And that aspect they've actually rather liked continuing. What they didn't bargain for, and has been the Damocles sword over them ever since, is to have a huge breakdown early in that process, which has only continued with the world's greatest power, and that is the United States. So that has been the source of so much of what politics plays out inside and politics plays out outside. And I think that the turn to China and Russia and the East is being finally accepted by the people in Iran as being the place they can trade. They have a massive economy. They're the 26th largest economy in the world, despite 40 years of sanctions. They have figured out a way to get through rentierism, the addiction to oil, and are exporting more non-oil products today because of sanctions. And so where are their markets? They're east. And so I think almost kicking and screeching, they're turning that direction. What that means in terms of the Gulf is not pretty. I mean, I think that Biden in many ways came in hoping to reduce the temperature in the Gulf. We're seeing it's gone up. And should Iran get a bomb, and that's why I get back to the fact that the JCPOA is the low-hanging fruit. It has built into it further negotiations and possibilities. It has to be renegotiated anyway, because so much important time was lost while it wasn't functioning, that several of the sunset clauses don't work for either the US or Iran. So these have to be renegotiated. But in the process, I think that what we're seeing is the ratcheting up of the situation in the Gulf, and Iran feels increasingly isolated. The deal with Yemen, for example, didn't include it. And I think in many ways, it feels as though it's a player. It needs to be included. And that's always been its problem in dealing with, as the sort of on the back foot, the original cancel culture object, if you will, with the United States, is it never feels it's included. And it exhibits outrageous behavior as a result in order to do so, in order to be so. So I think that the situation could change a little bit if there was more trust, but there's none. And so I think it would go from bad to worse.
Oh yeah, Jim, go ahead.
Very quickly, because Roxane has raised this twice just now, and then early when she was talking about the impact of us and the JCPOA on moderates and others. If there's one thing I've learned over a long career, including on the ground trying to do it, is the idea of regime change or regime influence because of us. We do a disservice to a heroic man who once put a rocket into my house, Qasem Soleimani, by saying that his whole life was simply reaction for being ignored by the United States. That guy and much of the Iranian establishment is on a mission. It is a mission to proselytize and expand throughout the region. That's the problem, the fundamental problem why we haven't been able to get over our quote biases against Iran and embrace them as a normal country. As Henry Kissinger said, Iran has to decide in the end whether it is a country or a cause. We can influence these things only on the margins. Big countries, and Roxane explained how powerful and successful Iran is, make decisions based upon their own assessment of the world, not simply what Washington today is doing towards it. And the problem we have again in the region is Iran is on a march through the region. It shows no intention of stopping that. It did it when we were kind to it from 2013 to 2018. It did it when we were harsh to it before and after that period.
Can I chime in here for a moment?
John, I would just say, and I think this is what you're going to get to, John, a lot of very smart people, including one of my old bosses, Senator Joe Lieberman, were opposed to the JCPOA, and they're certainly not isolationists. No one ever accused Joe Lieberman of being an isolationist. So how do you respond to people who say, you know, this deal is extremely problematic and are very ambivalent or worse toward it?
Well, there's some very legitimate concerns about it. You know, is any deal a perfect deal? No. I mean, that's the whole purpose of negotiations. You have to make compromises. And again, as I pointed out, it was viewed as a foundation stone that you could then try to strengthen its terms and broaden its scope over time. And so, but I, you know, align myself with Roxane's point, you know, stopping what was a nuclear weapons program in its tracks, you know, gave, I think, the region a lot of breathing room and should have been capitalized. Now, I know Jim doesn't intend to convey the impression that Iran is a monolith and that Qasem Soleimani epitomizes all Iranians, because as we know, Iran, there's a broad spectrum of attitudes within the government, within society. And unfortunately, I think too often we say Iran did this, Iran did that. Well, there is a political struggle inside Iran. And moreover, as I mentioned before, there's a prism in Iran. And you look at the Sunni states around it that are aligned with the United States, and whether it be Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, Afghanistan, and others. And Iran believes that it is the protector of the Shia people at a time when Sunni extremism has reared its ugly head, as Jim knows very well personally. And so there needs to, again, be taken into account some of the things that Iran is doing because it's trying to advance its own national security interests, skewed as it may be, certainly from our perspective. And I'm not justifying anything that Iran has done that has involved bloodshed. But at the same time, I think it has to be put into the appropriate context of the history of the region, of the troubles that we have seen, and the fact that you have a struggle inside of Iran right now, I think, between people of different persuasions. Just like in the United States, when you say America believes this, well, America, while Trump was president, is much different America than when Obama or Biden are president. So I think we have to work our way through this and have a more realpolitik approach. And unfortunately, there are too many people who have this ideological view toward Iran that they're an evil empire and we cannot trust them with anything. Well, I'm sorry, I don't think that this is going to provide, you know, the dividends that I think we're hoping to gain as we engage with them on a critically important issue, which is not to have another nuclear weapon in the region. Pakistan has it, Israel has it. We don't want others to go down this path.
So, Jim, is there pressure? And we'll come back to you, Roxane. I have the same question. There are Americans who are being held under false political charges. I believe one of them has been there over 3 years now. The human rights situation in that country continues to be horrific. We've already talked about the abuses in other countries and the extension of power, and of course, you know, threats against U.S. soldiers in the region. Even Jim, even if let's say that something happens and we both sides return to the JCPOA as previously written tomorrow. What else can we do to improve Iran's behavior? Or let's say we don't return to JCPOA. What can we do to improve Iran's behavior?
It would be all in all, on balance, better to return to the JCPOA, assuming we realize that doesn't solve and to some degree exacerbates the other problems with Iran. I disagree with John. I was present on the ground when George Bush took the decisions to turn Iraq over to its Shia Arab majority in January 2005. What did Iran do to that? It didn't relax its attempt to subvert the entire system in Iraq. It accelerated it and has been doing that ever since. That's been my experience on the ground in Syria, in Iraq, and in other places. Therefore, if Biden wants to go back into the agreement, it's important that at the same time, he has a program to contest Iran's presence in the region. It won't talk with us about possible withdrawal, say, of heavy weapons aimed at Israel from Syria, unless it has pressure on it. We provided some of that pressure by supporting Israel's very successful airstrike campaign against Iran and Syria, but it's still not enough. Only if Iran feels that it will not make any gains on the ground in the region because we're in its way, will it sit down and talk to us about its regional agenda. It is not a monolith, as John said, on most issues. On one issue where I have seen it be generally a monolith is on its regional policies. Zarif has no role in them. We know that well. When Assad went to Tehran, you remember 2 years ago, Zarif threatened to quit because Assad didn't have the time to talk with Zarif, because Zarif has nothing to say about Iran in the region. That's the reality.
Thank you very much for that. Roxane, did you have anything to add, or we'll move on to the questions now? Oh, you're on mute.
I think in many ways, Jim covered it. And I agree with many of his points. And so let's go on to the questions. I just wanted to briefly say that I do think that one thing we can add is if the JCPOA is not joined and Iran then goes on to create a bomb, there is a good chance that the Israeli government military will fulfill its promises to bomb it. And then we could get into a hot war. And, you know, we've gotten a taste just this last couple of weeks of what closing the Suez Canal can look like. Closing the Hormuz Straits could ratchet up the cost of oil and really rattle the global economy. So I really feel as though, and I really appreciate your contextual position on this, John. I think looking at it in terms of levels of analysis is simply that if Joe Biden does not want Iran to get a bomb, and that's generally what the US policy has been, the fastest and quickest way is to take the low-hanging fruit, which is what has already been negotiated as a verification system, making Iran the most inspected and monitored country in the world. Take that, stop that nuclear production. We saw the graph just drop when the JCPOA came in. And then we will be in a much better position. We'll be more trusted, we'll be a partner. And from our own position, we'll be legally back part of UN requirements. We'll be not in breach ourselves. And it will give us greater leverage, I think, in that sense. And so from that stage, we could go forward. Otherwise, I'm quite worried there's going to be a war.
Okay. Thank you. So both Roxane and Jim mentioned Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu famously personally lobbied Congress to oppose the JCPOA. He's been very loudly in opposition to it. One of the questions from the audience has to do specifically with Israel, but let's broaden it. If now that we're re-entering indirect negotiations, if we do move to direct negotiations or even look like we're going to sign, what will be the views or the pressure from other countries in the region, including Israel? And I'll leave that to anyone who wants to open it up with.
I'll start. It
Okay.
will depend on, I think they've already accommodated themselves. Biden made no secret that he wanted to go back into doing it. And as Roxane said, everybody does understand you don't want the tension of a few days away from a nuclear strike or a nuclear capability or a strike to stop it. The question will be, how does Biden deal with Iran throughout the region? The record so far is mixed, but it's also early. And I think through the whole JCPOA back and forth, we'll get a better idea of where it's going. That is how Israel in particular, but also the Arab states and Turkey will judge our seriousness.
Thanks. John, did you want to say something?
Well, Israel keeps a very close eye on what's happening inside of Iran on the nuclear front. It has very good intelligence sources and others. If it detects that Iran is going to go forward and increase the level of enrichment activity, that in fact could be that trigger that we've referenced. And I think Iran realizes that as well. I don't believe Iran wants to be hit by either Israel or the United States. And so I think it's been very, very careful as far as calibrating the violations. But Israel is going to be very, very focused on what's happening inside of Iran and will decide to take actions with or without the United States as it deems fit.
So speaking of Israel, this leads to another question on our list. There was a very funny movie out of Israel a few years ago. Maybe some of you saw Atomic Falafel, about the efforts of the Israelis to hide their nuclear program from IAEA inspectors, one of whom happens to be allergic to nuclear radiation. It's a very funny movie. But it leads to the question of, will the IAEA inspectors actually be able to tell if Iran is engaging in behavior that is banned under the JCPOA? I know from working with North Korea that it can be very hard to actually know what a country is doing on a nuclear program. So how confident should we be that this agreement would lead to inspectors actually being able to find out what is happening in the country? I'll leave that to anyone. Well, John, let's start with you because you used to run the CIA. So will we actually be able to know what they're doing there?
Well, one of the benefits of the JCPOA was a much more intrusive inspection regime of the IAEA. Was it, totally comprehensive, 100% foolproof? No. But that, complemented by intelligence capabilities of Western countries, Israel and others, I think it provides a pretty good look. Again, that doesn't mean that the Iranians are not able to hide certain types of activities. But I think on some of these major muscle movements that would allow Iran to move meaningfully along that path toward a weapon, I do think between the IAEA and other detection capabilities, we will have a sense of that. The government of the United States certainly will have a sense of that.
If I may weigh in, it's such a good question. And I had the chance of speaking with some of the nuclear inspectors not long ago, and it was absolutely a revelation to me because I'm certainly not a scientist. And the level of verification that the JCPOA brought in apparently is not only the general IAEA inspections, which any member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, receive, but there's this what's called the additional protocol, which is the one that allows these unscheduled inspections and these sort of shock arrivals and that kind of thing. And then there's this whole level of verification, which is unique to the JCPOA. And what they said is, no, it would not stop them entirely, but there is this choice. You either do it secretly or you do it slowly. And if you do it secretly, you can't do it quickly. And if you do it quickly, it will be out in the open. And so it slows it down either way. And I think that was the takeaway that I had on the verification, is that it just opens up space. And in many ways, nobody wants to trust Iran. And the JCPOA means we don't have to trust it. The IAEA looks at it and does that, makes it relevant. And I think we have to remember, this is a deal Iran signed. It's opened itself to this degree of inspection. So, it obviously is feeling that there's some benefit to having the other world powers trust it.
Interesting. Thank you. Any comments from you, Jim? Or?
Very, very briefly, I agree. It's the most extensive forever, but it has one flaw. The prior military dimension was shoehorned out of the agreement. The IAE was never allowed to truly get into that, and Iran has still blocked inspections of military bases. That's a concern. It's not an overwhelming concern if you can verify, which I think we have now, or we would when we get back to it, all of the other steps in production of fissile materials. But the fact that Iran has managed to hide and erase away its whole militarization program, which flies in the face of the famous fatwa, in which Israel, embarrassingly for Iran in 2018, went in and grabbed the whole warehouse full of that stuff and now has it on display. that is a problem.
Probably worried that the names that might come out from that revelation might be on a target list for countries that have a tendency to assassinate those involved in the nuclear program. Just saying, Jim.
Very good question here. Is there any evidence that the Trump administration's maximum pressure policy has accomplished anything? And I'm going to add to that. Has it accomplished anything positive, or has it possibly accomplished anything negative?
Yeah, I'll start with that, as I was part of it. What have we accomplished with then Vice President Joe Biden's Ukraine policy since 2014? The Russians are still in Crimea and in the Donbass. So we would say that's a failure. It was a very sophisticated military sanctions, diplomatic, collective alliance system response. What it has done is it has frozen the conflict. They haven't gone any further. They have paid a price. They'll have to think once, twice, or three times before they do another 2008 South Ossetia, before they do another 2014 Crimea. And they haven't done anything more since then. That's what we succeeded in doing from 2018 until very recently. As I said, from 2013 to 2018, Iran ran amok through the region. From 2018 on, they were cut back on the money they had. We saw this dramatically with the Quds Force allied units in Syria. They had far less ability to pay these people. They were trying to slough them off on the Syrian government, which had even less money because we were sanctioning them too. They were pummeled by the Israelis. We pressured the Russians enough so that they could not support the Iranians against the Israelis. We kept our troops on, at times against Trump's better judgment, but they stayed on. And all in all, it basically froze the situation. Same in Iraq, where we've now got an if you will, to some degree, an anti-Iranian, or at least anti-Iranian militia prime minister for the first time in many years. So it accomplished not very much, but it stopped the forward movement. But most importantly, the region supported this and was happy with it. And that's why they're looking for Biden to try to continue it.
Roxane, historically, the Iranian people liked the American people, or even liked the U.S. We have to distinguish, I think, between the government of Iran and the Iranian people. At the end of the day, our two countries actually have an enormous amount in common when you start thinking about it. Is that still true? I mean, do people still like the U.S. or U.S. people, or is there a danger that we're going to lose the street in Iran if we don't play this properly?
I think it's quite ambiguous. I think it's always been quite ambiguous, to be honest. I think that we tend to take the facts that we like and make them big, and then we sort of ignore the ones we don't. And I think there has been a great deal of ambiguity about how the street, as you call it, looks at the U.S. I think that the U.S. is complex. It's a heavily military country, and that's felt in Iran in particular, where over the last, since the first Gulf War, Iran has more or less been surrounded by American military, and I think that's played in how they feel about U.S. culture. And I think the U.S. has also itself increasingly become divided internally, and therefore its translation of what protecting democracy means for a country like Iran is more nuanced now. And I think its soft power is beginning to be affected by the fact that its own practice of democracy and its own use of the military in place of diplomacy in that region has affected the way things have gone forward. I'd be really interested to hear what John has to say about that.
Yeah. Well, first, I think one of the biggest downsides of the U.S. decision to pull out of the JCPOA was it laid waste to U.S. credibility on the world stage, pulling out an agreement that it signed on to, that the Security Council passed a resolution endorsing. Why would a Kim Jong-un decide to go into a nuclear deal with the United States if the duration of such a deal could lapse at the end of an administration? Why should the Iranians now believe that a agreement that Joe Biden might agree to, going back to what JCPOA was, status quo ante, is going to last any longer than January of 2025? There are some serious repercussions, I think, of this. And I think the Iranian people, both in the government as well as in the streets, feel that the United States is practicing these deceptive tactics because of the setbacks that Jim pointed out rightly in terms of that Iran has endured as a result of signing on to the JCPOA, doing away with the program, but then not reaping the financial benefits that it hoped was going to be able to, yes, to help to strengthen its military capabilities, but also to alleviate a lot of the economic problems that the country itself has. So I do think on balance, there has been it's been detrimental to the United States, to the region, and to the world.
Thanks. We each have 1 minute now to close off, so I'd ask for your parting remarks on the Biden administration's decisions to re-enter indirect talks, which I guess precede direct talks on the JCPOA. And if you can include what you think needs to come next. If we get into this agreement, if we can somehow return to the status quo ante, what comes after that? So we're going to go in reverse order. So Roxane, we'll give you the opportunity to speak first.
Thank you, and it's really been a pleasure to speak with such company and to explore this. Thank you very much. And my last point, perhaps, is that, well, you certainly know my view about that I'm concerned about Iran developing a bomb, and I see the JCPOA as a proliferation treaty, a non-proliferation treaty, and therefore I support going back into it. And I feel as though American leadership needs to be exercised as a result of that. So although in Vienna, once again, it's not face-to-face, it would be, I think, a relief. Speaking to the last question that you gave us, it would make the Iranians feel so much more as though that America really cares about them on the street, if either their access to humanitarian relief or to an IMF loan they've hoped to get COVID aid through was allowed simply to show goodwill and an awareness of what the people are enduring under COVID and also these sanctions.
Thank you very much. Thanks. That's excellent. John?
Yeah, once again, thanks for the opportunity to have this conversation today. I think it has been very, very worthwhile. I do hope that these talks that are underway are going to lead to a reconstitution of the JCPOA. I do think that the Biden administration can send some positive signals, even tangibly, to the Iranians that they are serious about returning to the JCPOA, even before Iran gets back into full compliance. I think Iran can say some things publicly as well that, again, are going to build the trust between the two countries. But I think the longer this goes on, I would agree with Roxane, it's going to be more difficult, in fact, to try to bring the two sides together. And I do think it's important early on in the Biden administration to get back into the JCPOA so that there can be some other talks about other issues. Iran is a big country, major player in the region. Anybody who still, hopes that there's going to be a toppling of the regime, I think they are just not dealing with reality. What we have to do is, with a combination of deterrence and incentives, try to push Iran in directions that maybe a lot of those hardliners are adamantly going to oppose. But I do think that there is a way to get them on a better track so that we can bring the level of tension down between our countries as well as the tension in the region.
Thank you very much. Jim, you're going to get the last word here.
Sure. The JCPOA is a limited agreement to limit Iran's abilities to rapidly get to a nuclear weapon. It's more limited now than before because of the sliding timescale, but all in all, it would be a good thing to get back to it and reduce that pressure. But again, the reason the original one ran into such trouble in the Senate, in the region, among all of our partners and allies in the Middle East, and ultimately in the Trump administration, was that it didn't deal with and seemed to some degree to undercut the efforts to, as John just said, deter Iran in other areas. There is a model. The Soviet Union, and I heard Joe Biden say this in a speech in 2015, We were able to do nuclear non-proliferation agreements, SALT, with the Soviet Union, while simultaneously pushing back really hard against their other efforts. That is the only model that's going to work with Iran.
And the Soviets honored their agreements. So there was that. Thank you to all of you. This has been a fascinating conversation. It will be available on YouTube within the next 24 to 48 hours. And happy spring to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.